So it's actually a great pleasure, and I want to thank everyone for being here and for the invite to moderate this panel, Is Ours a Petro-Culture, which I think is a very important panel in the context of everything that's been talking about. And what we're going to examine here is how oil in the oil industry impacts us from a cultural perspective. So the three speakers that we have, the first to speak will be Ruth Beer. And she's a professor of visual arts and material practice at Carr University. We're going to follow that by Stephanie LeMenager, who is a distinguished professor in English and American literature at the University of Oregon, and also the author of Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in America's Century. And the last speaker will be Sheena Wilson, who is are we going the other way? We switched. Okay. The first speaker, is what I'm hearing here, will be Sheena Wilson, is an assistant professor at the University of Alberta's campus St. John and director of the bilingual program. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to you guys. You have 7 minutes each, and I'm just going to sit down out front to allow you guys to see me when I put up my speaker. Go ahead. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you very much for organizing this wonderful conference and inviting me to speak. I'm going to speak a bit about this project called Tradingroom. It's a collaborative arts-based project funded by a 2013 SSHRC Research and Creation Insight Grant. And with my colleagues Glenn Lowry and Kit Grauer and collaborators Jill Baird, Imre Zeman, Jonathan Dewar, and Sadira Rodriguez, I've set out on a 4-year project that looks at a contested geography linking the oil fields in Alberta to the coast of British Columbia. The project is multidisciplinary and multi-sited. As the team struggles to come to terms with the research questions proposed in the initial application to expand public discourse, it's grappling with the complex questions around the cultural, political of contemporary art practice in relation to petrocultures and the respatializing of national interests, economic, social, and political. The work is exciting and challenging because it foregrounds the important relationships that need to develop amongst Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, curators, and scholars as we move into the field. It's clear, as others in this conference suggest, that we are remapping Canada. The localized effects of these developments are disproportionately borne up there in the north, away from the populated bustle of the geographic south. Nowhere is this truer than in the rural Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities of northern British Columbia and Alberta. Thus, we are challenged with methodologies that trouble the boundaries between academic research and practice, both scholarship and art, and its existence inside and outside of the universities. These methodologies also blur the lines across various stakeholder communities, Indigenous and non, urban and non, wealthy and not. Tradingroom is predicated on a metaphoric use or respectful appropriation of the historic grease trails. It hinges on an attempt to use the motif as both a foil to examine current social relations and an opportunity for dialogue, intellectual and cultural exchanges among the research team and various local communities. Recognizing that the Ulukin is a traditional staple of the Haisla, Haida, Tsimshian, and Toltec First Nations, and as such has a central role that's economic, cultural, and ceremonial in the life of different communities. Our project is framed by questions about the colonial nature of research, contemporary art practice and activism, and how this historical violence might be negotiated. To offer a short thumbnail sketch of the grease trails, what they are, let me offer the following key points. It's a dietary source. It's a small fish that runs in the rivers and to the ocean for northern coastal and interior peoples. Ulukin was known as a salvation fish because it arrived very early in the spring once the supplies were low. But Ulukin was also an invaluable trade item and could be traded for furs, copper, even canoes. The trails over which this trade was conducted came to be known as grease trails. Today, most of the grease trails have begun to be reclaimed by the earth. But in their place, a new network of pipelines is steadily being built over these former routes. As pipelines intersect and are literally built over territories which have historically held deep cultural significance to Indigenous peoples, we are confronted with a number of questions, each of which will be explored in an ongoing multidisciplinary artistic project. Whose land is this? And whose testimony is considered expert when weighing the relative risks and benefits of oil and gas developments on contested geographies? How might Canada's pursuit of a place among the world's energy superpowers impact Aboriginal people's rights to self-determination and traditional cultural practice? Artist Brian Youngin of mixed Swiss and Dene heritage has explored these questions in his artwork. The so-called native past embodied in works like Modest Livelihood, which you see here on the screen. It's a video projection. It's a collaborative video project with fellow artist Dwayne Linklater. It is once playful and profound, prompting viewers to consider the distances and proximities between cultures as well as those between humans and nature. We'll leave it on the previous slide. Thank you. The title, Modest Livelihood, the name of his artwork, is significant as it refers to the 1999 Supreme Court ruling verifying First Nations hunting and fishing rights, as we just heard from Janelle, while also limiting them to a moderate livelihood and denying these activities in relation to accumulation of wealth. Similarly, we may ask ourselves how the dominant metrics of wealth and progress, which are driving the infrastructural boom for oil and gas development projects, differ from traditional Indigenous knowledge systems. In exploring these questions and many others, Trading Routes will seek to create timely dialogues around Aboriginality, nationalism, and sustainability in relation to an emergent economic dependence of petrochemicals through joint efforts of artists, art educators, and cultural theorists of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal heritage, working in collaboration with local artists, academics, and storytellers. We'll just leave it there for a minute. As a university-based artist and educator, my work is based on trying to involve and engage groups and institutions outside the university. As an artist, I am interested in how the social and material worlds overlap and interact with one another. The historical function of grease trails, physical spaces linking the material and the social, epitomizes this intersection. Embedded within this is the consideration of site specificity in the process of realizing the artwork and its dissemination. Here you see a picture, well, we'll just leave it there. Here we see a picture of the work of Mia Fuhr. Shows that strategic exhibition context can provide effective ways to communicate knowledge. Consider Mia Fuhr's work, An Unkindness, which offers a modern glimpse at the material transformation of landscape by oil extraction operations. Beyond the aesthetically haunting vision of nature consumed, transformed, and twisted by human need, Fuhr adds an element of commentary simply by her choice of exhibition space at the Corcoran Museum of Art in Washington, D.C., the very site where politicians are now debating the Keystone Pipeline. Fuhr's work is illustrative is illustrative of the power of art to make a difference in knowledge and understanding. Art can be a probe, a provocation, and offer aesthetic, creative propositions outside of established ways of thinking to address the impasse that Imre so eloquently described yesterday, an impasse that requires reconsideration of our values and beliefs in progress. Artists can embrace productive uncertainty, provide insight, and offer speculations of what future will look like in the real world. An artwork can be exploratory, embody embody affective ways, forms, and materials that can mobilize audiences politically, aesthetically, when abstract, summative information may not. So to conclude, with this in mind, trading routes, we'll just do the next slide, please, and the next, and the next, and next, and we'll do one more. Thank you. To conclude, with this in mind, Trading Routes envisages speculations of a future imaginary from the standpoint of the very people whose lands could directly be affected by the extractive processes of petrochemical industries. It also involves artistic representations as the creation of artworks and exhibitions based on dialogue and exchange among Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal artists, storytellers from both urban and rural regions. Our experiences engaged in site-specific visual research and an emergent methodology sensitive to ethical protocols and principles of reciprocity. By extending an invitation for artists and cultural collaboration, Trading Routes seeks to take into account the interests of those whose land, livelihoods, and cultures would stand to be directly impacted by the encroachment of oil and gas development projects onto their traditional territories. And in the process, will seek to reconcile contending perspectives on ecological, economic, and cultural knowledge-scapes. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Hello, I'm Stephanie LeMenager, and I wanted to thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this really interesting conference. I also wanted to mention that I have affiliate positions in vegetarian and Marxist studies, and I'm very proud to hold those positions. Yes, I do. When I learned of the title of our panel today, I realized that one of the fundamental questions that drove the writing of my recent book, Living Oil, has actually been, is ours a petroculture? Excuse me, I guess there's a technical problem. Ours is a technoculture. Is ours a petroculture was really one of the questions that drove the writing of my book. And this is a picture of the book, which was just published about 3 weeks ago. And as many of you mentioned in the panels and discussions of yesterday, one of the pieces of that question, is ours a petroculture, which is most troubling and interesting, is what is the ours? And sort of what scale are we talking about in ours? And I realized as I was writing my book that my scale was regional, which again, interestingly, coincides with the scalar perspective that many of you have taken. Of course, it's also a deeply personal ours, and as such, political and potentially legal in a variety of respects. I'm speaking to you, of course, though, as a literature professor today. Now, I wrote Living Oil from within one of the most automobile-intensive regions of the world, the Los Angeles Basin, from within a newly active frack zone in which my home still exists, and from a family history in which oil played a primary role in my father's rise into the U.S. middle class at about the midpoint of the 20th century. So, as I suggest in the book, oil generates enduring, if deeply troubled, attachments and sticky affects. The dual commitments of my coastal region in California to the preservation of natural beauty, this is a commitment that is often tied to real estate values in that region, and to oil production as well, led me to consider the region more broadly as a vital intellectual frame for thinking about energy, and also to develop a critical method that I call commodity regionalism, which involves pursuing slippery objects like petroleum through the explicit material histories that they make in places as diverse as Bayou Lafourche, Louisiana, Santa Barbara, California, the Niger Delta, and Fort McMurray. And as a literature professor, I'd like to say that literature and art, which I also work within, I work a lot on visual art, are not only artifacts of material culture, but sites, for me, wherein we can see, with a clarity not always present in other modes of discourse, such as economics, how a resource like oil inhabits a region at an intimate scale, affecting even domestic relationships and our sense of self-worth. There's an emotional history, in other words, of the resource that comes through in arts practice that isn't always present elsewhere. Now, when I visited northern Alberta in 2012 to complete research for my book, I was going there in search of a very explicit object, and it was a museum, an oil museum, and I bet you can guess which one it is. I was writing a chapter of the book about oil museums because these museums prophesy energy futures by curating very explicitly ideological energy pasts. And I came also to Alberta for personal reasons as a kind of energy pilgrim, a descendant of a Texan, for goodness sakes, a penitent beneficiary of oil sands product, implicated in the petroculture that so-called unconventional oil is making, a petroculture that, again, like many others, I would emphasize, is quite distinct from that of the mid-20th century petroculture, when the fossil fuel complex was not relegated to, quote, what's left, in the words of Michael T. Clare, in shale and bitumen and ultra-deep ocean deposits. The home that I still own in Southern California sits atop the Monterey Shale Formation. It's right in the heady mix of the so-called shale revolution, which extends from coastal areas like the place where my house is, about a mile from the beach, into the Pacific Ocean. And I want to show you an image that was actually taken in the mid-20th century of the Ventura oil field. This is about a half mile from my house. We're very interested in, I think, aestheticizing and eroticizing infrastructure in Southern California. This picture is not a typical postcard, perhaps, but it was typical of what people thought was worth looking at and loving and being effectively bonded to, certainly in the middle of the 20th century. The seismic instability of the ocean bed in the Santa Barbara Channel makes offshore fracking particularly risky there. And shortly before I left my former position at the University of California to take on a endowed chairship at the University of Oregon, a frack well was verified to exist right off of the campus point where students typically swim. Around the same time that this happened, public universities in Pennsylvania invited fracking onto their campuses in an effort to supplement the loss of state funds that had been crippling their institutions and forcing unreasonable hikes in student tuitions and fees. On the traditional ground, the traditional pastoral ground, as it's likely conceived, of the North American University campus, intensive energy mining held a tainted promise. Can the children drink the money, if not the water? By the way, I'm virtually wearing a Divest McGill button. It's just not physically present. The Germ of Living Oil was an essay, now published as The Aesthetics of Petroleum, that responded to, among other things, a Wikipedia entry that was part of a student project that undergraduates submitted to me a few years ago. And the Wikipedia entry had asked this particular question, poignant and poetic in the way that Wikipedia often surprisingly can be. Why is oil so bad? Why is oil so bad? Well, I answered this question tentatively by saying to myself, what is petroculture? I didn't realize that was I was saying at the time, but that's what I was saying. And what I came up with was that petroculture has a lot to do with the indebtedness of various forms of media to petroleum. So my answer to the question, why is oil so bad, was because it has supported overlapping media environments to which there is no apparent outside that might be materialized through imagination and affect as palpable hope. What I mean by oil media are everywhere in North America is that they are suburbs, freeways, farms. I'm taking Marshall McLuhan's lead by saying that petroleum infrastructure is a kind of media. But of course, oil media are also the media that essentially boomed alongside the North American middle class. Fossil fuel-supported media include film, print books, recorded music, novels, magazines, photographs, and all of the interesting work that we experience on the internet. I actually put my own book to a test when I began writing it. I had a policy analyst do an LCA of the book in progress to discover exactly how much of my book's footprint would be, what the sort of scale of that would be. And I discovered after the LCA was completed, which is the appendix to the book, that my book is not quite as damaging to the environment as is a cheeseburger. But the primary reason for this is because so many more people consume cheeseburgers than academic books. So nonetheless, I still believe in print books, and I've only got a minute, so I'm going to have to make this very quickly, this point very quickly. But I think that we can do a couple of different things as academic writers to get outside of the apparently immersive total environment of oil. That's why I wrote the book, and that's why I'm still here talking about oil, because I do have hope. Collaboration is a really important part of academic scholarship and work. And in two ways I found means of doing it in this project. One was through commemoration, by which I mean the act of collaborative memory, of making memory visible to and with others. There's a whole chapter of the book on the Santa Barbara oil spill that includes an ethnographic dimension of interviews and such. And it's really a chapter about the radicalization of the middle class in that region as a result of the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969, a radicalization that was not inconsequential given the number of regulatory policies, 14 and counting, as well as actual lifestyle shifts, particularly around waste management that occurred in the aftermath of the spill. I think commemoration is a way of fighting what I call petromelancholia, or a kind of unresolved grieving of a conventional oil resource, easy oil, that doesn't actually exist anymore. In addition to commemoration, I believe in what I call collaborative plotting. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it, but maybe I'll talk about it with you at some other point. There's this particular digital media project and several other new media public arts projects that I've been involved with that really incorporate the voices of many people and communities which are affected by and alongside and in some sense obscured by petroleum infrastructure. So these are design models for organizing academic and scholarly research, collaborative plotting, and collaborative and interactive commemoration, which I'd love to talk about should I have more time in the future. Thank you.
I'm Sheena. Yeah. We've got things confused here. That's okay. We did talk on the phone, but we haven't seen each other, so yeah. Okay. So last Friday, I was driving between my home and the suburbs of Sherwood Park to the city of Edmonton along what's popularly called Refinery Row, and I was thinking about this presentation today. So with this petroleum escape in view, I was thinking actually about this news story of the 13-year-old grade 8 student in Balcarres, Saskatchewan, Tinnell Star, who's a member of the Star Blanket Cree Nation covered under Treaty 4. In mid-January 2014, she was told by school officials to remove her hoodie and then on another day to wear it inside out to hide the slogan, "Got Land" on the front and "Thank an Indian" on the back. And as I was driving, the Calgary CBC radio interviewer was talking about oil, as is often the case, and the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline hearings were under discussion. And during the broadcast, a lawyer and consultant for resource companies, including Enbridge on Aboriginal rights, declared, quote, "Certainly from my vantage point, I don't see an inherent weakness in that process. What the courts have actually said very clearly is that the balancing act between societal interests on the one hand and Aboriginal interests on the other are to be decided by government," end quote. The binary nature of the lawyer's comments, Isaac, his name is Tom Isaac, societal versus Aboriginal raises questions about our petroculture or about Isaac's petro-society. What are the limits where society, Isaac's society, ends and other interests begin? So in this case, Aboriginal interests. And where in this definition of society is Tinnell Star located? Where are women in general located, and where do issues of race and class intersect? Especially when this government so this was the 180, especially when this government in 2012, after labeling certain environmental and FNMI groups as extremist and radical, set up a counter-terrorism unit in Alberta to protect the province's natural resources and infrastructure, and has in the interim spent millions of dollars on ad campaigns promoting the oil sands and Canadian resource development. As First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities continue to protest resource development, it is useful to remain cognizant of what feminist scholar Heather M. Turcott has already identified in her research focused on the Niger Delta as the slippages within, quote, academic and state representations that produce the figure of the petro-terrorist gang member for public consumption and foreign policy. And to consider how these ideas are built upon conflicting representations of women and of feminism in the West in ways that have ramifications not only for women in Western petrocultures, but for ethnocultural communities and other marginalized groups here and around the world. Take, for example, the mainstream media representation of the Idle No More movement, started by 4 female activists in November 2012, and Chief Teresa Spence's 44-day hunger strike from December 11, 2012 to January 24, 2013. Spence and Idle No More were at that time protesting Omnibus Bill C-45. However, Spence's full set of demands were never explained by the mainstream media. Instead, media was focused on redirecting onto her health and dietary ramifications on her female body, a tactic that functioned to depoliticize her. Redefined to question the validity of the hunger strike, given that Spence consumed tea and fish broth. This introduced an opening into questioning her ethics, which developed into allegations of financial corruption, and rerouted to publicize suggestions that she refocus on family and community, rhetorically banishing her to the private sphere by reinvoking her status as mother-grandmother. These practices, as Turcotte has already identified in the Niger Delta context, rationalize women as, quote, unpolitical and external to the political economy. Meanwhile, the mainstream Canadian media provided space for male Aboriginal leaders to declare that it's time for the men to step up, and the political discord within the Aboriginal movement and its leadership was provided significant attention, reinforcing classic notions of ethnocultural communities turning in on themselves as a manifestation of petro-discord, rather than the typical leadership struggles common to any community. Furthermore, Aboriginal leadership strategies are referred to using terminology such as tactical, aggressive, extreme, angry. These media practices, in combination with changes in Canadian legislation that have criminalized certain forms of environmental protest, sets the stage for what Turcotte has identified as the construction of racialized men as terrorists when active in these same petro-resistance movements that are often initiated or led by women. Almost simultaneously, the Idle No More movement that Spence inspired was also being undermined through reports of inadequate leadership and media coverage that increasingly linked it to violence, either violence initiated by aggressive elements within the existing Aboriginal leadership structure or as violence against Aboriginals that rhetorically blames the victim for causing racist reaction. The gang rape of an Aboriginal woman in Thunder Bay, Ontario, for instance, was reported to have allegedly been motivated by the Idle No More movement. This event and others were used to insinuate that violence is somehow endemic to these resistance efforts and used to discourage Aboriginal youth and their communities from participating. As a rhetorical strategy, this spectacularizes and markets petro-violence to the media-consuming public as a reaction to Idle No More, rather than as a legacy of colonial logic, human rights abuses, and gender sexual violence on which Western petro-states are founded. By contrast, certain forms of consumer-based resistance, marketed largely to middle and upper class, often white women, are condoned. Ecofeminism in mainstream popular discourse come to be signified by reductive and trivial issues. So where does Tinnell Star fit into all of this? Mainstream media reports on Star's hoodie protest repeat many of these same patterns. One CBC report suggests that the shirt had been identified as racist. Why it is racist and to whom the racism is directed is unclear in the coverage. In one breath, it seems that non-Aboriginals are offended, perhaps because the slogan destabilizes one of the cornerstones of our current economy, the right to private property. And then in the next breath, the TV news clip suggests that offense was taken to the term Indian. And along with the accusations of racism, Star was chastised as being rude and cheeky, all things a young woman should never be. Similarly, Teresa Spence's body and diet, as well as the validity of the hunger strike, became the media focus rather than her political issues. And much like Spence's status as an older female figure are used to depoliticize her, Tinnell's gender, age, and status as a schoolgirl are used to undermine her as a figure of resistance. Mainstream press construct her as the damsel in distress, repeatedly mentioning the pink color of her sweatshirt and her confused response to the controversy as she, quote, didn't understand why people were offended. Alternatively, the Aboriginal press constructs Tinnell and her mother as conscientious protesters who are part of a larger community movement. Some of the last reports of Tinnell before she vanished from the mainstream media sphere 2 weeks ago tell of how her family was advised by RCMP to deactivate her Facebook account, ultimately silencing her and cutting short her protest because she had become the victim of racist cyber attack. Affirming Turcotte's theories of petrosexual politics outlined earlier, the mainstream media predictably invents Star as a victim of violence who can best be protected by withdrawing from petro protests. And the media, failing to link this instance of racially motivated violence to a history of violence against Aboriginal women endemic to the colonial legacy of our petro nation, erases its contextual relevance through a focus on the potential racism of the hoodie itself. Ultimately, the focus of the sweatshirt discussion shifted to the maker and distributor of the sweatshirts, And several articles across the country carried the story of his increased sales as a result of Star's media coverage. So while Idle No More announced that it would be taking up the issue of Gotland in its January 28, 2014 teach-in, the subversive nature of the sweatshirt and its ability to inspire dialogue has now been neutralized in the mainstream media sphere through a reduction of resistance as commodification. Supporters across the country are encouraged to buy hoodies, a shopping spree that reinforces what Zizek has called the Starbucks logic of collapsing consumerism and social justice into condoned acts that support the existing political economy. Whether the discussion is of pipelines or wind turbines, understanding how women's resistance to petropolitics is strategically managed, subverted, and neutralized by mainstream power discourses provides some insight into how the inequities of our current society, as understood by Isaac, are sustained. In other published works, I analyze the fictions of ethical oil, where Eastern Muslim women are saved by the West. Women's images abroad and at home are recuperated from the runways of high fashion to the hallways of high schools in popular culture and late monopoly capitalism. But it is not oil that places society and its needs in opposition to Aboriginal or women's interests or the interests of the un or underemployed. And the way these issues intersect, oil merely fuels those interests. Thank you.
I want to thank all three panelists for a great set of presentations, and we've saved enough time to have a little bit of discussion if there's questions, and we have about 20 minutes to do that. Are there questions to begin with that we want to go, or should I kind of, there are? All right, we have a few. I'm going to let it go to the people that have been here, and in many ways have us breathe for the moment and say that I haven't done justice yet to the bios of the three presenters up here, and I hope you'll have a chance to hear from them now as we go. So if you can have short, pointed questions directed to a speaker, all of them, that'd be wonderful. Please.
I just want to thank you very much, Ms. Wilson, for your presentation. I found it very inspiring. So, Dancy, my name is Tiffany Harrington, and I'm an Indigenous student here at McGill. And my question is towards Mrs. Beer's address. As Métis leader Louis Riel stated, my people sleep for 100 years, and when they awake, it is the artist that will give them back their spirits. But how can we as artists have others realize that there is no such thing as art at all? That all of us are capable of being creative and all are obligated to reimagine our lifestyles and our relationships to the land. How can we stay away from labels of what is an artist or a scientist or an economist and realize that what is missing is not more research, but greater respect, stronger understanding, and a revitalization of what Riel calls our spirit?
Thank you. Thank you. Please, Ruth.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think there is great difficulty when the definition of art is a closed one. In our project, we think of art not necessarily as a painting on the wall or an object in the middle of the room, but really a means of dialogue, a means to synthesize ideas and bring them to the public sphere. So I think the debates about whether something is art or craft or I think more important to think about its possibilities, its potential to change ideas, to bring to light, to bring insight into issues. So our project is very sensitive to the idea of learning from First Nations. We are interested in listening and learning, and that's the basis on which this is predicated.
Sheena, can I ask you if you wanted to say anything about, do you want to add in, or?
I think you did a great job of answering that question.
All right, good, great. We'll go to the next question and open it from there. Please, thank you.
I'm an MA student at Carleton University in Canadian Studies. It was so nice to see some fellow humanitarian, humanities department representatives. So Stephanie's presentation made me think of museums, and I wasn't sure if you're aware of the Ontario Museum of Oil in Oil Springs, Ontario, as our colonial legacy does stand back before Confederation, and just to think about those more longer-standing colonial legacies of petroleum as we've been drilling and refining oil in this country for over 150 years. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I wish I had gotten to all the oil museums, not only in North America, but worldwide. There's some really interesting ones internationally that move outside of the U.S. and Canada, for sure. I didn't get to that one. I went up to Fort McMurray because I was quite interested in the Oil Sands Discovery Center up there, and felt, as I said, rather tied to what was happening up there because of my own region, which is so auto-intensive in its usage. But I did see quite a lot of colonial legacy of U.S. oil production down in the museums of East Texas, where the mining culture has been deeply segregated. This kind of segregation in oil mining communities and camps in the United States have been in many respects exported internationally, including to Saudi Arabia. And there's a wonderful book by Robert Vitalis about that. So that's an interesting, thing to think about in terms of how pasts can predict futures. And in this case, I think we're talking about the future of labor and the kind of misuses at this point in time, too, of migrant labor forces. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a few more minutes, and I know everyone's hungry, but if you just want to bear with me, I want to just ask the panelists one final question, because I know they all had only a certain amount of time. They did amazing to bear with me as I stuck my fingers in the air to say only 2 minutes. And I wanted to know if you could just, in the question of this panel, is there a petroculture, just speak a little bit about your own personal approaches to this question and any final comments you have before we end the panel and have lunch. Can I ask Stephanie for you to go first and just kind of think about that kind of a question and your own interdisciplinary or disciplinary approach to this, and any final comments you might want to add?
Sure. One of the things that I realized while writing the book was that I couldn't be a literature professor only in approaching this topic, that I had to kind of rethink the literary on a number of different registers and scales, and rethink narratological art as my broader topic. And that's why I ventured into a lot of different humanities fields and disciplines as best I could to pursue the very dirty and slippery trail of oil, particularly in the contemporary period. So I would just say that this is a topic that requires a very large narratological intelligence. I think part of the problem is that the story hasn't changed. And, when you hear people making particularly reactionary arguments about what oil is and does, it's a very old story coming from the middle of the 20th century and the sense of futurity that was plausible at that point in time. We're good storytellers, we're good narrators, we're very good at understanding how narrative works as cause and effect and also as cognition and cognitive capacity in literature departments. And I personally am very invested in looking at narrative across media as a means of ecological survival as we move into a period which is inevitably going to be one of transition away from a set of unconventional and unsustainable fossil fuels. So.
Ruth, I saw you scribbling there, so I'm going to go first while Sheena scribbles her notes, and then we can go and end with Sheena there. Please.
Well, I think there are many petrocultures, and that's one of the things that we hope to learn more about. How do people value the land? How do people value energy? What sort of accommodations are they prepared to make? From an artist's point of view, I'm very conscious about the use of materials in what I do. I think the materiality of art can be very effective and, as I said before, create other ways of thinking that are perhaps less divisive than we see in popular media. It does suggest also that the materials I use are sometimes toxic materials, and I have to think twice about how I accommodate the visualization and realization of work that perhaps can move towards a more dematerialized form than the sculpture that I've been more committed to. I'm also very interested in oil's relationship to cultural institutions. And there are, of course, the impact and the contextualization of galleries as we know it. I mentioned the Corcoran and how that was significant. But there are many other kinds of museums, like the Oil Museum and cultural history museums, where this kind of work can be considered an intervention, can mix or undermine with the stories there, or create a different kind of dialogue. And of course, within the art and the public sphere, bringing petrocultures to public spaces as events and public art.
Thank you, Ruth. Sheena, you want to wrap this all up for us with some final thoughts and some ideas, and then I'll just say a few words, and we'll be off to lunch. Please, Sheena. Thank you.
Well, I think when I first started studying, when I first started researching petrocultures, it seems to take you in all sorts of directions. Do you talk about oil? Do you talk about plastics? Do you talk about the politics? What do you do? How do you change your life? But I started out my talk today talking about how I'm driving, the refineries are there, and I think that if we can all admit that we live in a petroculture, we can debate the issues of petroeconomy, but we can look around this room and see all of the petroleum products everywhere. We live in a time period where we've had an impact on the environment. And if we could just understand that we live in a petroculture, then I think we can let go of some of that hypocrisy or those accusations of hypocrisy. We all, in my opinion, live in a petroculture. That doesn't mean we can't also aspire for change. So you can say you live in a petroculture, you can also work towards change, and by just admitting that and breaking down those things, I think that we can have more interactive, cross-disciplinary dialogues across communities, because these are the kinds of positions that allow for attack, right? Well, you drive a car, so you can't want change. You're an Aboriginal person who works in the oil industry, so Aboriginals must not really be worried about their treaty rights. These are easy ways to attack people, but we all live in a petroculture, and I think we all want to save the planet, so we have to start talking to each other and listening, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Sheena. I'm going to wrap up now. There's one quick announcement. I just want to thank Stephanie, Ruth, and Sheena for an excellent presentation and great work, you guys. Thank you very much. One quick announcement.
One quick announcement. We're having lunch now from 1 to 2, but at 20 to 2 in this room, Brenda Longfellow, who will be speaking later on a panel about her work offshore, is going to be presenting for 20 minutes or so parts of that film. So please feel free to bring your lunch back in here at 20 to 2, and there will be that presentation before the afternoon sessions start. That was amazing.